And we welcome back Reverend Paul Johnson, and he's going to speak to us about a religious liberal looking at the cross. Reverend Johnson.
In the traditional Christian calendar, today is Palm Sunday, commemorating the entrance of Jesus into Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover with his disciples. A crowd waved palms as they welcomed him. And one of the first things he did when he got into Jerusalem was to go to the temple, and he was aghast at what he saw. Luke describes it this way: and he went into the temple and began to cast out them that sold therein, and them that bought, saying unto them, it is written, my house is a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of thieves. And then he went on to teach daily in the temple. But the chief priests and the scribes and the chief of the people sought to destroy him. Mark and Luke, the other two, or rather Mark and Matthew, the other two synoptic gospels, add the fact that he turned over the tables of the money changers and the seats of them that sold doves. The doves were sold to the poorest of people, but everyone buying had to trade in their Roman money for temple money in order to buy an animal to be sacrificed around a Passover time. And they charged a very, very huge rates of exchange. And that's what Jesus thought made them a den of thieves. And in the ensuing days, he engaged the religious authorities with all sorts of criticism, all the way until Passover. The authorities didn't arrest him during those days because they felt he had such a popular following that it would lead to a riot. But then we know how after Passover, they retired to Gethsemane, and Judas betrayed him. Jesus was arrested and crucified by the most, one of the most horrendous means of capital punishment ever devised. Cicero said it was cruel and disgusting, and that no Roman should even consider it in mind, or it should not come to their eyes or even ears. It was so despicable, but it was often used for the most desperate of criminals. A person would first be scourged, then march through the streets as he carried a portion of the cross at the place of execution, be nailed to the cross, and placed then in an upright position, would be stripped of all clothing, naked before all the people watching. And of course, Jesus wasn't the first to be crucified, first Jew. Back in 4 BCE, the general Varus crucified 2,000 Jews. Can you imagine that scene of ultimate human pain and desperation? It was such a cruel punishment. Sometimes a person would languish on the cross for days before dying, and death would come primarily by asphyxiation over that period of time. In Jesus' case, his death took place just in 3 hours. Now, the Christian Orthodox interpretation of his death became one of substitutionary atonement. His ignominious death, ordained by God the Father, atoned for the sins of all people, so that by repentance from sin and belief in Jesus' sacrifice as the Son of God, people might be saved from the judgment for their sin and saved from everlasting hell. Now, our Unitarian forebears, going way back in history, probably back to the 16th century, did not believe this doctrine. They thought it was terrible. It sullied the reputation of God as a loving Father. Our principal American Unitarian founder, William Ellery Channing, said that it falsely put a gallows at the center of history. And of course, not only Unitarians and Universalists have disavowed this doctrine of the substitutionary atonement, but other religious liberals as well. I was surprised. It's a couple years back now when Nicholas Kristof of the New York Times interviewed Serene Jones, the president of Union Theological Seminary in New York, around Easter time, and this is what Serene Jones said regarding the doctrine of the substitutionary atonement. Quote, the pervasive idea of an abusive God Father who sends his own kid to the cross so God could forgive people is nuts. For me, the cross is an enactment of human hatred. And of course, her approach goes way back to the early 20th century when Walter Rauschenbusch and others formulated the social gospel, that Jesus was important because of his teaching of justice and human regard, rather than because of his atoning death. But because the cross has become considered so widely as a symbol of the substitutionary atonement, Unitarian Universalists have come to take a dim view of it, to say the least, and don't use it commonly as a symbol. I've only seen it used in one church, that's King's Chapel in Boston, which became Unitarian in 1785 after the Revolutionary War, one of the first congregations to become avowedly Unitarian, but they consider them still Christian Unitarian. And so they don't buy the substitutionary atonement, but they have the cross, as do other Unitarian Christian churches in New England, as representative of Jesus' moral stance for which he died, for which the religious authority ultimately talked Pilate into killing Jesus. Now, with that as a background, let me tell you a story. A number of years ago, in one of my previous congregations, we had every Sunday we had a cabaret, a nice luncheon, and one or two tables were set aside for visitors, so that they could meet some of our members and ask questions about Unitarian Universalism and about our congregation and get to know us. And I remember one Sunday stands out in my mind because a woman came who had a cross and a necklace around her neck. And one of our members said to her, kind of in a warning fashion, people don't wear crosses here. That's not part of who we are. And I was aghast. I felt terrible. What an unfriendly, off-putting thing to say. The woman making the comment was correct. I could never recall seeing a regular attendee, a member or friend of the congregation, who wore a cross. But it was so uncalled for to say something that was so off-putting. But you know, I didn't say anything. And as I thought of this over the years, I said, that was not the right course of action. I necessarily didn't have to take issue with the statement of the woman about people not wearing crosses right at the time, but I could have talked to that woman who was wearing the cross over the phone or in person to countermand that whole issue as it was presented to her by that group of people. Obviously, she had come to the service because she was attracted to us in some way, maybe something that she had seen on the internet or something that she had read, or a friend had directed her to us. And what a rude awakening to be challenged in this way. So I thought of this over the years. What should I have said about the cross to this woman in terms of Unitarian Universalism? And I think the first thing I would have said, or should have said, was we don't have a policy of outlawing or disproving the wearing of a cross. You know, I like what's on our Facebook page. I assume Beth has put it there, where there are symbols of 6 world religions and encouraging people to come, whatever their background. I really like that. If you did that, Beth, thank you so much for doing that. But we don't have a doctrine about wearing a cross. We don't have a doctrine saying that people who believe in the substitutionary atonement cannot be Unitarian Universalists. We have a general statement of purposes, which if people feel comfortable with, I'm sure they would feel comfortable with us, because there are many different viewpoints about the person of Jesus. Going back, in my estimation, to James Freeman Clarke, who was quoted earlier in the service, who formed the Disciples Church in Boston, and they had people of all stripes of belief about Jesus, from the Son of God and the atonement for the world, to those who believed he was human, perhaps a prophet who had a special mission, but didn't have any divine status whatsoever. He said the important thing is that we want to model our lives after the very admirable aspects of Jesus' moral teachings. And that's what's important to us. So that would be the first thing I'd mention, that she would be welcome, regardless of whether she wore a cross or not, or whether she believed in the traditional doctrine of the substitutionary atonement. And I would say that many Unitarian Universalists honor the cross, particularly Unitarian Universalist Christians, because it honors the way that Jesus stood up for social justice and paid the price with his life. This was true of Channing, who I quoted earlier. The authorities had it in for him and finally were able to talk Pilate into executing him. This past week, I went through the Gospels, particularly the Synoptic Gospels, the most historical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which recounted Jesus' teaching in the temples each day, and he just excoriated the scribes and the Pharisees and the temple authorities, accusing them of hypocrisy and even of shamelessly cheating widows out of their property, and then pretending to be pious by making long prayers in public. What I was curious as to what Jesus meant by this, cheating widows. And one commentator said, greedily cheat widows out of their property, in quotes. In ancient times, widows had little or no power in the courts. It was not uncommon for a husband to appoint in his will a Jewish legal expert, a scribe or Pharisee, to be the executor of his widow's estate. Essentially, this gave the executor authority to oversee the widow's finances and assets. It would not be hard for a corrupt lawyer to find legal ways to trick a widow out of her house and other property. And this is precisely what the religious leaders were doing. And so Jesus was very, very critical. And of course, this increased their desire to do him in because of his criticism. The other thing I would say to this woman about the symbol of the cross is that it does stand for a symbol of how over history the state has had, as our Constitution says, unreasonable and punishments of various kinds, and has created so much human misery. Have you ever heard of drawing and quartering? This became law in 1283 in England for treason, and the person would be dragged behind a horse to the gallows and be hung, but not until death. They stop just short of death, and then disembowel the person while the person was still alive, and then behead the person, and then cut his body into quarters. Can you imagine the human pain and agony involved in that? It was the law of the land in England till 1870. Or think of Michael Servetus, our first Unitarian, who was put to death by Calvin in Geneva because of his Unitarian stance, and actually burned to death. Can you imagine the human agony involved in that? But also, paradoxically, the cross is a bit of a symbol for me of human progress. Do you realize that of the 195 sovereign entities in the world, according to the UN, only 55 have legal capital punishment? And 23 of these, it's used very, very little because it's so difficult for it to be used legally. Of course, it is legal in 27 of our United States jurisdiction, and the Samoan, of course, in our federal government. We have a long way to go in that regard, I think, as a religious liberal in this country. But think of that moral progress over the centuries, that of 195 nations, only 55 in which it is legal, and then 23 of those, it's very, very difficult. Now, that's not to whitewash the fact that there are many, many cruel aspects of capital punishment in the world today, but it's much diminished over time. So human progress in that light is something to celebrate. So I would share my concern with her that, and my belief with her, that Jesus was executed for his moral stand against religious hypocrisy and injustice, and therefore it has meaning for me as a religious symbol. Another thing I would share with her is that the cross has been associated with the substitutionary atonement as an aspect of belief. John's gospel says that in order to be saved from eternal hell and to have the benefit of Jesus' sacrifice on the cross, you have to believe in him as the Son of God and as the atonement for your sin. That's pretty tough if you have difficulty believing. It makes belief a moral issue. And I think in the heart of hearts, we believe what we must, that belief is not a moral issue. The one verse, of course, that everyone learned in my evangelical church background was John 3:16. That God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. And that is really at odds from John, which is really the oldest gospel to be written, some say between 80 and 100 AD, as opposed to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which were written earlier and I think are more historical. Luke says, a lawyer stood up to test him and said, "Master, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus said to him, "What is written in the law? What do you read there?" The lawyer replied, "You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." "You have answered right," said Jesus. "Do this, and life is yours." Very different from belief, isn't it? In Mark, a man came to him and asked, "Good master, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus said, "Why do you call me good? No one is good but God alone. You know the commandments: do not kill, do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not bear false witness, do not cheat, honor your father and mother." And the man said to him, "Teacher, I've kept all these commandments from my earliest days." And Jesus looked closely at him and said, "There is still one thing you lack. Go and sell everything you own and give the money to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come and follow me." I'm glad he said this to this young man and not to me. But isn't that interesting? There again, it wasn't belief, but it was his actions. And in Matthew, there's an interesting one as well. He said, "On the final day, we will be judged on whether we fed the hungry, clothed the naked, gave drink to the thirsty, welcomed the stranger, comforted the sick, and visited the prisoner." So there, it wasn't your right beliefs, it was your right actions. I think that's important for us to understand as Unitarian Universalists that these teachings of Jesus stress action and works, not beliefs. So that's what I'd say to this woman, these aspects about the cross, that I don't have it in my home as a religious symbol. I don't have it in, we don't have it in our church currently, but it still has a place and a meaning for me because Unitarianism and Universalism came out of the moral teachings of Jesus. And I want to close with another story. I don't know if I'd share this with the woman or not, probably. But the first church I served was in Hanscom, Minnesota. It was in a rural area. And it was a church that had been formed in 1881 when a number of people from the local Lutheran church could no longer accept Lutheran theology. And they called as their minister a Unitarian minister from Norway who had been hired as a missionary to Scandinavians by the American Unitarian Association. And they were able to build the church. And in this church, ultimately, under the second sermon, Minister Amandus Norman, they included an altar which had a painting of Jesus befriending a young boy. It was the idea of the minister's, Amandus Norman's wife, to have this representation of the scriptural phrase, Jesus said, "Let the children come unto me." And so Jesus has his hand in this picture, in this painting, on a little boy's head, in kind of a fatherly way. And they also had on this altar a cross, which was there until the mid-70s, when the current minister said, well, we're beyond this Jesus business and this cross business. And he enlisted some men in the congregation to take that altar out from the front of the church. And they said, we're not going to have this anymore. Well, all hell broke loose, because for a lot of people, that's what they wanted in the front of the church. And so they arrived at a compromise. They had a curtain that could be drawn over this picture of Jesus and the cross, and then a flaming chalice formed out of metal to be on this background of the curtain. And so they would have, sometimes Jesus' picture would be present, and sometimes the curtain would be present. And interestingly, when I interviewed with their pulpit committee, they said to me, Paul, would you have the curtain closed or would you have it open? My goodness, what a thing to ask a prospective minister. I said, you know, if you choose to have me as your minister and I choose to come, I won't touch that curtain unless someone wants it open or closed in reference to a child dedication or a funeral or a memorial service or a wedding. I will honor the wishes of the people who have this sort of special service in mind. And that's what I did for all of my almost 6 years there. But then it came to where my wife and I, Carol, were to be married there. And I'm sure people said, is Paul going to have Jesus present or not? Well, in honor of my minister who had come long before me, Amandus Norman, and in honor of the church's traditions, we had the picture open. So Jesus was there. But by the time I got there, they had sawed off the cross on the top of the altar. And I always wondered, what was that all about? And I did a sermon similar to some of the points that I made this morning about this at the start of Holy Week, about the meaning of the cross. And a man came up afterwards who said he was the one who sawed that cross off. But he said, Paul, we didn't throw it away. It's underneath the platform. So there I had been standing all those 6 years over the cross. And in a way, that's kind of a metaphor for what the cross means to me as a religious liberal. It's not in the forefront, but it's underneath. It represents my tradition, my heritage of what it means to be a Unitarian Universalist who believes the important thing about Jesus was his moral teachings, and not that he was an atonement for the sins of the world. So there you have it. Religious liberals look at the cross.